Hi all, Dr. Clark here again, Natural Resource Management. Today we're going to talk about the biogeochemical cycles, which is sometimes just called the biochemical cycles, but because it involves a lot of things that can be broken down out of the soil or rocks, the proper name is the biogeochemical cycles. Okay, most of you are fairly familiar with a couple of them, like the hydrological cycle or maybe the carbon cycle. Okay, but we're going to also talk about the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, which you might not be as comfortable with those two cycles. Okay, so here's just an easy kind of description of a piece of the carbon cycle. Real world issues going on right now and pretty much always going on is forest fires and burning of fossil fuels. In both cases, they're going to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide can be picked up by plants through photosynthesis, where they're going to get photons from the sun. They're going to pull in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they're going to pull in water molecules from the soil. Right? Combine that, make carbohydrates. Okay, and we'll come back and we'll look at photosynthesis in much greater detail later on. Some other small players are things like animal and plant respiration, where they might be releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere also. Soil respiration, so decomposition, things like that, releasing some of that carbon dioxide also. Okay, so we'll look at this again in a little bit more detail as we progress. Okay, so first let's talk about the hydrological cycle. Okay? The hydrological cycle is just the path of water through a certain environment. Okay? Now we can look at really big picture, and that's what I'm going to show you today. Kind of, the role that the ocean plays, freshwater lakes play, groundwater table plays, snow, rain, transpiration coming off the plants. We can look at all those, or you could look at a hydrological cycle in just one kind of water table. Okay, so if you're interested in the hydrological cycle in your region, you could look at the water table that your house or your property belongs to. And then you could see what role would changes in the environment have on that hydrological cycle. Okay, what role would removing water from the cycle, what role would that play? Do you have plenty of water? Do you have too much water? Okay, and so you can look at it at different environmental levels, and we'll talk about how that's done, and we'll talk about the nutrient flow into some systems where we're not looking at big picture, but we're looking at the hydrological cycle in a small area and predicting what might happen if we added excess nutrients into that cycle. Okay. Now, from a big picture, okay, what we're going to talk about today, solar energy is a huge portion of the hydrological cycle, and that solar energy is used or captured by water. Okay? And in the process of capturing the photons, water will be vaporized. So it'll start to evaporate off. Okay? And this is a big deal in the oceans, but also can be very, a large portion of freshwater systems are evaporating also. But when you talk about an ocean that's 70 so percent of the planet, okay, it's a large amount of evaporation. Okay, and that's really where the rainfall and moisture, the precipitation comes from on the planet, is really coming from our oceans being evaporated off. Okay. So that occurs, the sun, solar energy evaporates water, the water condenses. Okay, so we talked about this coming from a chemistry point of view. Water droplets are attracted to each other, and form polar bonds with each other. So when vapor goes into the atmosphere, okay, it'll condense. So water is attracted to water molecules. It'll condense, and then when it makes it to a heavy enough form, when there's enough, water droplets or water molecules to form a drop, okay, and then it will fall from the sky in the form of water, or in the form of rain or snow, or depending on the conditions on the terrestrial landscape. Okay? And that's kind of how water goes from the ocean back to the terrestrial environment. Okay? Then from there, there's all kinds of ways in which the water molecules can move. They can be brought in by like cell metabolism. So maybe an organism picked up that water molecule and stored it, okay, as kind of a carbohydrate, and then you consumed that organism and made metabolic water, okay, and returned the water back to the environment. Okay, there are lots of other ways. You can get transpiration coming off of plants. You can get sweat, so vapor coming off of animals. Okay, there's all kinds of ways which water molecules can re-enter the cycle and be removed from the cycle for a limited amount of time. Okay, and we'll look at some of these as we progress. So here's just the general hydrological cycle. Okay, you can see that the majority of water through every system is really coming from the evaporation of the ocean. Okay, so 425,000. Okay, and most of that is coming back to the ocean through precipitation over the ocean. Okay, so a huge amount of water is just recycled through this evaporation and precipitation over the ocean atmosphere. Some of it makes to the terrestrial environment, okay, and can be precipitated over the terrestrial environment, okay, and then goes through either evaporation on the terrestrial environment, runoff back into the ocean. Transpiration can have a huge play, so this is basically respiration of water molecules from plants. So plants, when they go through photosynthesis, they have these little teeny pores underneath their leaves called stomata, and they have to open those pores to take in carbon dioxide. When they open those pores up, okay, water molecules can escape through vapor, okay? And so you get transpiration, this water returning back into the atmosphere. Okay? And so we can look at this in a little more detail, okay, by watching this video.
Let's look at the science of rain and how raindrops form. First, we'll need the sun. When the sun shines on water on the Earth's surface, the heat of the sun warms the water, turning it into an invisible gas called water vapor. This process, the changing of water into a gas, is called evaporation. Because gases are lighter than liquids, water vapor rises up into the sky. And the further you move up and away from the Earth's surface, the colder the temperature gets. So in the sky, the water vapor cools and changes back into tiny water droplets. This change is called condensation and is the opposite of evaporation. Clouds are made up of tiny water droplets, so when condensation occurs in the sky, clouds form and grow. Let's take a closer look. When water droplets bump into one another, they stick together and grow in size. They continue to grow until they are too heavy and fall as rain. They even grow as they bump into one another on their journey from the cloud to the ground. And every single raindrop that reaches the ground is made up of 1 million of the original tiny water droplets. Raindrops fall on the ground's surface where the sun can shine on them, and the whole process happens again. This is called the water cycle and keeps water moving from the ground to the sky, providing the water needed for plants, animals and people to survive. So now you know.
So there you can see the hydrological cycle kind of in a video. Most of you are fairly familiar with it. Okay, you've probably been taught the hydrological cycle since like middle school. Okay, the reason why I want to go over it just a little bit, okay, is because when I talk about evaporation, precipitation, transpiration, condensation, okay, I want to make sure that you guys know what those terms mean, and you don't really have to look them up, and that's really why I went over it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the carbon cycle now. So the carbon cycle really starts with carbon dioxide. Okay, this is the important player in the carbon cycle. Okay, and it can start with carbon dioxide and its role in photosynthesis. So we can start there. So, like I said before, carbon dioxide enters the plant. Carbon dioxide is combined with water molecules and photons from the sun. That energy is used to make sugar molecules or carbohydrates. Okay, and then when that is consumed, okay, it can be released through cellular respiration as carbon dioxide again. Okay. Now, sometimes, often in our environment, and often in the world today, that carbon dioxide was trapped as carbon molecules and carbohydrates, okay, in plant tissues for millions of years. Actually, hundreds of millions of years. Okay? And after hundreds of millions of years, if a plant is buried and under intense pressure, okay, it will turn into multiple fossil fuel types. Okay? It could be natural gas. It depends on the chemistry of the soil and the pressure that was placed on it. It could be oil. Again, depends on the condition. Or it can be coal. Okay? And so these are ways which carbon can be stored in a different form. It doesn't resemble really plants any longer or animal tissue any longer. Okay? Animals can be utilized in this form too, okay? Like small micro marine organisms and things like that can definitely be converted into coal, oil, and natural gas. Okay? So it can be stored in the soil system for a long period of time, okay? Hundreds of millions of years. Okay? Now, some of that really has to do with this carbon sink idea. Okay? So carbon is removed from the atmosphere and stored in living vegetation. Okay? And it's just a food source for plants. Okay? So carbon dioxide comes in, stored in the tissues, so they can convert that into glucose initially. Okay? And then depending on the plant, it might, combine it and make fructose, it might combine it and make starch, it might combine it and make, other things like sucrose, cellulose is definitely going to be made, okay? And we'll go through like what that means. But this carbon dioxide is becoming what we call a carbon sink. Okay, it's bound up in living vegetation. Then, if that living vegetation dies, okay, it can be released back into the atmosphere, and it often is. Okay, but sometimes that living vegetation dies and it's buried. Okay, and so the carbon doesn't get to release back into the atmosphere. And so even while the plant is on the surface and decomposing, carbon is being released to the atmosphere, or at least released into the soils, and then released into the atmosphere. Sometimes if it's buried over a long period of time, you get these other types of carbon sinks. So you can get carbon sink from the vegetation point of view, and then you can get a carbon sink from a soil geological point of view. Okay? So any part that consumes carbon is called a carbon sink. Okay? And then any part that releases carbon, okay, in the form of typically carbon dioxide, but it could be carbon monoxide, okay, is called a carbon source. Okay? And we know this. We know that burning ancient carbon, okay, so burning fuels like coal, natural gas, oil, okay, releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a faster rate than plants can take it up. Okay? We know this because we can measure this. Now, there's very, very good evidence that suggests that as you increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's going to make kind of a film. Okay, so it's going to fill in the ozone. Okay, and by doing so, it doesn't allow heat to be released from the planet. So sometimes the photons are perfectly fine. They'll come through. And remember, when we were talking about amount of energy that's reflected back, okay, remember that the planet is only using about 2% of the energy that comes to the planet is used by plants, etc. Certain percent is going to be absorbed by the oceans and the terrestrial system, but depending on the area where we're talking, okay, but probably 50% of the energy is going to be pushed back out, okay, reflected off the surface and try to escape the planet. Okay? The more carbon dioxide you have in your ozone layer, the less that can leave, okay? Which in turn increases the temperature of the planet, okay? And would cause what we can consider global warming. Okay? We've known about this for a long time, and it happens all the time. Okay? But it's this ancient burning of coal, oil, and natural gas that might be speeding up the process, might be speeding up the temperature, the increase in the temperature. Okay? And most evidence suggests that this is the case. Okay? So we'll come back to this in a little bit. Okay? But first, let's talk about that carbon cycle. Okay? Again, okay, we're looking at atmospheric CO2, okay, and its effect on the planet, but besides that, we can look at the role that carbon plays. Okay? The carbon dioxide or the carbon cycle is extremely important, okay? Because all living things are made of carbon. Okay? In actuality, all living things are mainly carbon. Okay? So when we talk about carbohydrates, when we talk about proteins, when we talk about nucleic acids, we talk about lipids, okay? Carbon is the main element in every one of those molecules that build up living tissue. Okay? So it's very, very important. Okay? And through photosynthesis, we can capture a lot of that carbon. Okay? But the other things that are going on, okay, with burning of fossil fuels, look, it's not adding all that much by burning fossil fuels, okay? But it's adding enough that the plants can't pick it up. So now we have more, okay? The plants pick up about 100 gigaton of carbon, okay? And by adding more into the atmosphere, okay, even respiration from soils and plants, okay, is going to add 100 gigatons, and so you're already at, just this portion of the cycle is already at maximum. So anything that we're doing by clearing lands, burning fossil fuels is adding more than the plants can take up. Okay? This can be an issue, okay, with temperature. Okay? And we're going to watch a little video, okay, that talks about this process in a little more detail.
Our atmosphere, just a thin layer of gases surrounding our planet, absorbing solar radiation, retaining heat to warm the Earth's surface. A delicate mixture of gases separating life on Earth from the rest of the cosmos. But when this mixture of gases gets out of balance, the temperature rises and alters our climate. Carbon is an essential component of Earth's atmosphere, but it's also the primary driver of our warming climate. And NASA scientists are learning more by studying how carbon dioxide moves through the atmosphere, ocean, and plant life. When people burn fossil fuels and clear forests, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. But only half of that carbon stays in the atmosphere, warming our planet and contributing to climate change. The other half is removed from the air by the planet's ecosystems and ocean.
A huge question is, in the future, as the carbon dioxide builds up, will the land and the ocean continue to take up that 50%? Do they get saturated, they're full, and they quit at some point, or do they always just take up more and more and more?
In some regions, forests are releasing more carbon than they're storing.
Forests gain carbon as they grow, and they release it as they die and decompose. And processes like drought, pests, fire, and deforestation contribute to the release of carbon.
Like vegetation on land, ocean water absorbs carbon dioxide from fossil fuel emissions. Doing so, however, changes the chemistry of seawater with wide-ranging impacts on marine ecosystems. And as surface water in the ocean continues to warm, carbon uptake will slow down at some point. Models of atmospheric CO2 help us understand what our satellites see, so we get a more complete picture of this global carbon cycle.
We can check our models against atmospheric observations like those provided by OCO2, and if they look reasonable, then we have confidence in using these models to predict how carbon is going to change in the future.
NASA is utilizing its unique science capabilities to increase our understanding of our home planet, improve lives, and safeguard our future. Your planet is changing. We're on it.
So here you can see, this is one of the newest models that's put forth by NASA, and this is capturing CO2 emissions. And if you look, it's hard to say that humans are not contributing to carbon dioxide. Okay, so this is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, and it's measuring carbon dioxide throughout the entire atmosphere. But the areas where populations are highest, India, Japan, China, Russia, Europe, okay, so now it's flowing this way with the winds, United States, okay, so populations that are really high and burn a massive amount of fossil fuel have huge emissions of carbon dioxide. Areas that might have lots of people still, okay, Brazil, okay, Africa, Australia, but they're not emitting nearly the amount of carbon dioxide that you see in these countries that are developed and burn a large amount of fossil fuel. Okay? And we'll come back and we'll look at that. We'll look at some data and some figures that show just how much energy, okay, is coming from fossil fuels. About 98 to 99% of the energy is coming from fossil fuels in these developed countries. Okay? Another cycle, the nitrogen cycle. Okay? And the reason why the nitrogen cycle is important, and it often doesn't get talked about, because we're talking about global climate change, when we're talking about carbon dioxide, then we're talking about the hydrological cycle and the fact that we're running out of clean water on the planet. But we often don't talk about the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, although it's extremely important when we're talking about the construction of proteins, nucleic acids. Okay, when we look at the role that nitrogen plays in the environment, okay, it's very, very important to also know something about the nitrogen cycle. So again, it starts really with plants. Plants are taking up inorganic nitrogen from the environment, and then organisms can eat those plants to build muscle, and plants are using it to build things like DNA, but so are organisms that eat plants. Okay, and some of the protein that plants make are going to be incorporated into seeds and things like that. But overall, the nitrogen cycle is very important for muscle building organisms, okay, animals mainly. Okay, but I often get questions from students like, hey, I have this plant at home, It was doing great. Okay? I water it every day, but it kind of looks sick. Can you tell me what to do with it? And you know, first thing that I tell students is it's probably not getting enough nitrogen. Okay? There's plenty of carbon dioxide. You already told me that you water it all the time, but you need to feed it. Okay? And what we feed plants is nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay? Because they need the material to build proteins and nucleic acids also. Carbon dioxide's fine and water's fine. That's going to build carbohydrates. That's their main source of energy. But they also need sources of protein, and every time they build a new cell, they have to be able to make nucleic acids so they can copy their DNA. Now, some plants do this naturally. Some plants have the capability of fixing nitrogen. So they have symbiotic bacteria that are associated with their roots. Okay? Things like aspen trees. Okay? Most of you are fairly familiar with aspens. Okay? Things like peas, soybeans, any of the legumes, okay? They all have the capability of having these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Willows, okay? So these are important plants because they have this capability of fixing nitrogen and bringing in their own nitrogen, so we don't have to use fertilizers and things like that, bringing in their own nitrogen, and then that nitrogen can be passed on to other organisms that can consume it. Okay, and the bacteria do this by converting it into ammonia, and then into nitrates and nitrites. Okay, and then, like I said before, the plant can then take that nitrogen and convert it into proteins and nucleic acids, and then pass it to animals. Okay? So the nitrogen can re-enter the environment in a couple ways. If the plant is not consumed and dies, okay, then microorganisms, decomposers, will decompose the tissue and return the nitrogen into the soil. Okay, and then it can be captured again by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and the cycle keeps going. Otherwise, you can also get this nitrogen cycle returning the nitrogen via excrement and urinary waste. Okay, and so you get excrement from, you know, terrestrial organisms or aquatic organisms. Okay, and you get nitrogen back into the cycle that way. Okay. Now, some of the nitrogen will escape, okay, in the form of nitrous oxide, okay, in the form of gas. So it makes it back into the atmosphere, okay, in the form of gas. And we'll probably look at this a little bit more because it's fairly important in some regions that this process can continue. Okay? And then, you know, with modern technology and human capabilities, we can alter the nitrogen cycle a lot in certain regions, okay, by using synthetic fertilizer or nitrogen fixing crops, or by dumping excrement, urinary waste, okay, by burning fossil fuels. We can add nitrogen back to the atmosphere, and we can change the nitrogen cycle. And we have, in some regions, changed it drastically. So here you can see okay, we can cause, you know, fertilizer runoff by fertilizing farms, okay, by having cattle next to waterways and things like that. You can increase the amount of nitrogen in a waterway. Okay, and lots of people have probably seen pictures of this occur. You look at lake homes. I'll pick on a state like Minnesota that has lots of lakes. Okay, but they have a lot of lake homes too, and people like green grass, so they'll dump fertilizer on it, and then it runs off into the lake, and now the lake is green. Okay, because the lake has too much nitrogen. Okay, and it'll cause algae blooms, and the whole lake will be green, and then it goes anoxic. There's no oxygen in the lake, all the fish die, and it can cause huge issues. Okay? And we'll watch a little video later about that system. Okay, but the other thing that can happen is, just by burning fossil fuels, you're still going to increase nitrous oxide that enters the atmosphere. Okay? Lightning and volcanoes, okay, they'll increase a little bit of the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, not much. These are kind of natural processes, and there is some though. But for, the main thing is, a lot of times what we're doing is we're digging up some of the stored nitrogen and we're putting it right back on the landscape through fertilizers and things like that. And that can damage this nitrogen cycle. Okay? So here you can see these are little bacteria nodules or root nodules, okay, with beneficial symbiotic bacteria that's in them that have the ability to fix that nitrogen. Okay, so the plant itself is not fixing the nitrogen; it's this symbiosis with this bacteria that fixes the nitrogen, okay, and allows those plants. And so you'll often see farmers that don't like to use fertilizer, so they'll do rotational crops. So they might plant soybeans one year, and then the next year they plant corn. Okay? And that's because they're adding nitrogen to the soil with the soybeans, okay? And then they're absorbing that nitrogen with the corn. They're taking it out. Corn doesn't fix nitrogen. Okay?
Nutrient pollution is a widespread national problem and is well documented in places like the Chesapeake Bay, the Mississippi River Basin, and Puget Sound. Nutrients, like nitrogen and phosphorus, are a natural part of the ecosystem. They support the growth of aquatic plants. But human activities cause an excess of nitrogen and phosphorus in the environment. Surface and groundwater becomes polluted, creating a serious problem known as nutrient pollution. Nutrient pollution can affect you and your family's health, as it threatens our drinking water supplies and places where we like to swim and fish. Excess nutrients can also cause an explosion of algae growth called algal blooms. These can be foamy, scummy, or a thick mat of slime on the surface of the water or along the beach. Some algal blooms are harmful because they produce toxins that can make people sick. These blooms also hurt tourism, reduce property values, and drive up water treatment costs. The nutrients move downstream, killing fish and creating large dead zones where no aquatic life can survive. It's one of the most serious water pollution issues facing our nation. Nutrient pollution comes from farms, lawn fertilizer, pet waste, city streets, faulty septic systems, and sewage treatment plants. Limiting nutrient pollution from excess nitrogen and phosphorus will protect people's health, support the economy, and keep America's waters safe for swimming and fishing. Awareness is the first step in preventing and reducing nutrient pollution. Learn what you can do to make a difference at epa.gov/nutrient pollution.
Okay, so that is a good segue into the next cycle, and that's the phosphorus cycle. Okay, again, just like nitrogen, phosphorus is needed to make DNA and ATP. Okay, so DNA, the phosphorus is really part of the backbone. We already talked about this. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, okay, is really the energy which cells use to do work. Okay, and so phosphorus, if it's missing from the system, cells can't be copied, so there's really no DNA, and there's no energy for them to absorb other carbohydrates and other things that, is essential for the cell to live. Okay? And so, there's a couple ways that you can get phosphorus. You can get it from rocks and minerals, okay? And you can also get it from stored phosphorus that occurs in, say, the bottom of the ocean. Okay? You can get huge amounts of phosphorus sinks in the bottom of the ocean. Okay? And a lot of the phosphorus, okay, is going to be returning to the environment through decomposition, just like nitrogen. Okay? Organism dies. Organisms like worms and microscopic nematodes and things like that will start consuming that rotting flesh, okay, and return nitrogen and phosphorus back to the soil and then back to the plant so it can be utilized to build more plant material. Okay. Now, sometimes though, we'll get huge phosphorus sinks in the ocean, okay, and occasionally you'll get a big impulse of phosphorus out of the sink of the ocean, so out of the baseline in the ocean, the bottom of the ocean, you'll get some overturning, okay, that occurs, and phosphorus, you'll get these huge influxes of phosphorus, which can drive photosynthetic organisms to explode, okay, and that's majority of the time that's that has nothing to do with man, okay. This can happen during tropical storms. This can happen, those kind of things can really stir up the bottom of the ocean and get some of that ocean sediment to come to the surface and provide phosphorus back to the surface. Okay? But where man comes in is we often take it from rocks. Okay? So we can take it from soil phosphates, okay? And we can add that as a fertilizer to our landscape. Okay? And then, animals can, decomposition of animal material, decomposition of plants through decomposing, they can add it back into the atmosphere or back into the cycle. It can go back into the soil, back into the water system. Okay? But it's the fertilizer runoff that can be a huge player and change the chemistry of the system. Mainly in freshwater systems, but you can still get it occurring in oceanic systems. But this is a big player in freshwater system typically. Okay? And so again, we'll talk more about all these cycles. We'll talk about the role that humans play in the cycles, how we can change the cycles. Okay? What can we do to still produce the same number or same amount of crops, okay, without changing the phosphorus or nitrogen cycle? Okay? How can we exist on the planet with the same amount of energy without adding carbon dioxide? And how can we keep our waters as clean as possible without changing or altering the hydrological cycle? Okay? So I'm just explaining these cycles in general to you, and then we'll come back in and we'll look at each kind of piece of the cycle and talk about the role that humans can play in trying not to disturb that cycle. Okay, so with that, okay, we'll come back and we're going to actually switch a little bit to talk about evolution, because now we're going to talk about the role that humans play in organism evolution, okay, and what we're doing to different ecosystems and things like that to change how species evolve, okay, and then after that we'll talk about more of a sustainable role that we could play in the ecosystem. Okay, all right, till next time.